In 1989, inside Ormley Lodge in southwest London, Diana stood in a hallway with a folded letter in her hand and the sound of a party carrying softly through the house. It was one of those careful notes Charles was good at by then. Polite, controlled, a few neat lines asking for calm, for sense, for no scene. She read it once, then again, and without changing her expression, tore it into narrow white strips and let them fall into the ashtray on a side table. Then she lifted her head, opened the door, and walked toward Camilla. No one in that room expected the silence that followed. Years later, people would hear part of that confrontation in Diana's own words. But the private shape of a night like that lives in the smaller things. In how long someone stands before going in whether they smooth their dress twice or only once, in whether they arrive as a wife or as a woman who has finally decided she will not be managed. And if you stay for stories like that, the quiet ones behind the photographs, subscribe now, because this was not the kind of royal moment the cameras were ever meant to catch. By then, the marriage had already been wearing thin for years. Charles and Diana still looked like a royal couple in public, because that was the job. There were engagements, handshakes, arrivals, departures, cars with dark windows, and that practiced distance people often mistake for dignity. But privately, the ground had shifted long before the country had language for it. By the late 1980s, Charles had grown close to Camilla again, after reconnecting at Highgrove in the middle of the decade. And in their circle that was not really a rumour anymore. It was one of those truths everyone carried carefully, as if not naming it made it less damaging. Diana had learned by then that there were two kinds of humiliation. The public kind, where a smile has to stay in place while something inside you hardens. And the private kind, which is worse because it arrives in fragments. A pause on the telephone, a name repeated too casually, a car journey explained too neatly, a bracelet, a look, a change in tone when a certain person enters the room. Nothing large enough to hold up like evidence, just enough to make a woman feel she is being asked to doubt her own mind. That was what the letter was really for. Not peace, not kindness, just one more request to keep carrying the unbearable politely. Earlier that week at Kensington Palace, William had stood in a doorway while Diana sat at a writing desk she wasn't using. A tray of tea had gone cold beside her. He was still young enough to ask direct questions and old enough to notice when adults were pretending. He had asked if she was tired. She smiled too quickly and said yes, only tired. He looked at the papers on the desk, then at her face, and did not press. Children in royal houses learn early that silence has rank. But he lingered for a second longer than usual, as if he understood that something was wrong, even if no one had given him the words for it. That was the cruelty of those years. The public still saw the Princess of Wales in gowns, on tours, at state occasions, stepping out of cars under light and noise. They saw glamour and youth, and the kind of beauty that made rooms tilt toward her. What they did not see was how often she was left alone with conclusions no one wanted spoken aloud. In houses like these, truth was not forbidden exactly. It was simply treated as bad manners. A marriage could fail behind velvet curtains, and everyone would still discuss the flowers, the food, the guest list, the speeches. Everything, except the thing itself. At Ormley Lodge that night, the house was full enough to protect everyone and small enough to trap them. Voices carried up staircases. Glass touched silver. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Diana arrived with Charles, which made it harder for the room to relax. People who knew too much suddenly became interested in their drinks. People who knew only a little sensed that something had moved beneath the evening and did not know where to look. Camilla was already there. So was Andrew Parker Bowles. That mattered. In these circles, even betrayal preferred good furniture and proper company. Charles, for his part, was said to be talking too steadily, which is often how anxious men reveal themselves. Not by fidgeting, but by sounding slightly more reasonable than the moment requires. Diana saw him before he saw her looking. He was seated near Camilla in a drawing room, angled inward, comfortable in a way husbands should be careful about when their wives are standing in the doorway. It was not an embrace. It did not have to be. Sometimes intimacy is just the absence of effort. Sometimes it is simply the fact that two people do not have to perform around each other. Diana noticed that first, not the closeness, the ease. There are moments when a life divides quietly, not with shouting, not with broken glass, just with a woman deciding she no longer intends to be the last person in the room, expected to cooperate with the lie. She asked Charles and the other man to leave. She did not raise her voice. That was the part people remembered later, how calm she was. Calm can be more frightening than anger when everyone has been counting on your self-control to protect them. The room was quiet. Camilla stayed seated for a second, then adjusted herself almost imperceptibly, as if preparing for weather. Diana looked at her and said what she would later admit publicly in part, but in that room it landed with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid for too long. She knew what was going on. She wanted that understood. She would not be treated like an idiot. It was not theatrical. It was worse than that. It was precise. A clean wound. Camilla, who was not a fool and not easily cornered, answered with the logic of someone who believed the arrangement had already become reality. "You have everything," she said in effect. "The attention, the children, the position. What more could you possibly want?" Diana did not answer immediately. That pause mattered. She had spent years being told, directly and indirectly, that a royal wife should value image over intimacy, position over honesty, survival over love. She looked at Camilla the way people do when they finally understand the terms they have been living under. Then she said the line no one in that world could make sound trivial, no matter how hard they tried. "I want my husband. Not my title, not the photographs, not the arrangements. Him." It was a devastating sentence because it was so plain. If you've ever seen one simple truth change a room, tell me in the comments. It happens more often than people admit. The unexpected thing was not that Diana confronted her. It was that nobody could convincingly pretend afterward that she did not understand her own life. That was the role some had preferred for her. Emotional, unstable, difficult perhaps, but not fully clear, not fully exact. That sentence destroyed that comfort. "I want my husband." It exposed the gap between what the public thought a princess possessed and what she privately did not. It also exposed something else. That behind the pageantry, all three of them were caught in a structure that rewarded discretion more than decency, and control more than truth. Charles reappeared afterwards, and those who watched closely would have seen it before a word was spoken. The slight caution in his face. The way Diana no longer looked toward him for cues. The changed geometry of the room. People think consequences arrive as announcements, but often they arrive as seating. As who speaks first in the car, as whether someone waits by the stairs or goes up alone. The party continued because parties like that always do. Glasses were refilled. Someone laughed too loudly somewhere else in the house. But something had shifted, and everyone with any instinct for power could feel it. Back at Kensington Palace, the atmosphere did not improve, because the truth had finally been spoken. That is not usually how these things work. Truth rarely brings comfort first. It brings rearrangement, fewer illusions, different habits, a colder kind of clarity. William noticed more than anyone meant him to. Children always do. A closed door that used to stay open, A meal moved by 10 minutes. A mother quieter after returning from somewhere. A father present but not available. No dramatic explanation. Just the slow education of a child realizing that adults can remain in the same picture while no longer living in the same emotional world. Outside the palace gates, the old machinery kept going. Crowds waved, flashbulbs popped. Newspapers still preferred the broad outlines over the intimate damage. The public image of the marriage would take a little longer to crack in the open, and when it did, it would come with books, tapes, headlines, and the ugly relief people feel when a rumor becomes printable. But by the time the rest of the country began catching up in the early 1990s, nights like this had already done their work. The separation announced later did not begin in Parliament or on front pages. It began in rooms where everyone knew and no one wished to say it first. What made Diana unforgettable was not only that she suffered in public, it was that she kept searching, stubbornly, for something real inside a world built on appearance. Sometimes that made her impulsive, sometimes it made her difficult, sometimes it made her braver than the people around her could comfortably tolerate. A woman can forgive many things before she finally refuses to be patronized. That may have been the real breaking point in that drawing room. Not the affair itself, terrible as it was, but the expectation that she would continue carrying its weight with grace while others kept the rules. And the letter, or what remained of it, stayed behind in pieces. A few thin strips of paper in an ashtray, then perhaps one caught near the rim, then later gone with the rest of the evening's evidence. That feels right for a story like this. Not a grand object kept for history, just a small act of refusal no one bothered to archive. The real record survived elsewhere in Diana's memory, in the changed air between three people, in the years that followed, and in the unmistakable fact that after a certain point, she was no longer asking permission to see her own life clearly. Near the end of the night, the house quieted the way large houses do, after too much careful conversation. Outside, London was dark and damp. Inside, a lamp was left on in the corridor, and somewhere downstairs, staff moved softly among glasses and plates, and the remains of an evening that had not gone as planned. Diana passed through that light alone for a moment, one hand at her side, face composed again, almost unreadable. But she was no longer carrying his letter. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. Some endings do not begin with a goodbye. Sometimes they begin with a woman tearing paper, opening a door, and finally saying the one thing no one wanted to hear.